Awesome, thanks. Nice to meet everybody. I am Chris Corde. I run our security operations product team at Google. So that includes Chronicle, now a lot of the Mandiant family, as well as Simplify, which is an acquisition that we made at Google last December, as well as VirusTotal. So I have a long history in the security space. I'll talk a little bit about my background at RSA, and then prior to coming to Google, I was VP of product and user experience for Carbon Black. So I kind of ran the full Carbon Black cloud and understand the detection and response space really well. So what I wanted to do today is really talk about what we're doing with security operations, what our vision is at Google around how we deliver an outcome-driven security operations solution, how Mandiant really fits into that, and why Mandiant was such an important piece of this overall portfolio, and really just give a flavor of the vision on how everything is coming together. So one thing I always like to harken back to is when I started in security, it was probably like 2006 or so, and I worked at RSA for the first 8 years of that time frame. And I don't know if many of you remember what RSA in 2011-ish was involved in a pretty large-scale nation-state attack, right, where effectively Chinese nationalists were going after the secure ID token seeds, if you remember. And interestingly enough, like when that incident occurred, we actually called Mandiant. It was the first engagement that we had, with Mandiant back in 2011. And I remember Kevin coming into the office when Mandiant was still a pretty, small company, and helping to engage and really do a deep dive forensic kind of pull on how that attack occurred. But there's some really cool articles that have been written recently about this, right? There was a 10-year kind of pause in terms of whether or not we could talk about the RSA attack, and now that 10 years has passed. So if you're interested, go read this Wired article. It's like a really good rundown of how it occurred, how it was found, and how we try to go about triaging that incident inside of the RSA organization. And one of the reasons I bring this up is that RSA at the time was the preeminent security brand. CrowdStrike didn't exist as a company. Palo Alto didn't exist as a company. RSA was the brand at the time. We had a security operations center that we would bring people into. We would showcase. We had all the latest and greatest tooling. We had expertise in-house. And there wasn't a lot of large-scale nation-state attackers, pushing really sophisticated attacks at the time either. That was a fairly new trend that was occurring. But even with all that, we were not successful in stopping this attack. And in fact, we were pretty lucky that we even stumbled into it in the first place, to be perfectly honest with you. So we had just bought a company called NetWitness, right? So at the time, we were seeing the trend lines that people wanted better detection and response. They wanted better forensics inside of their infrastructure. They wanted better visibility. We had an old school SIM called Envision, if anyone remembers that, which wasn't a very good SIM. So we said, hey, let's go out and buy somebody who can do deep levels of network forensics. So we bought NetWitness. We started using it and installing it inside of the organization. And it just so happened that the analyst, the tier 1 analyst that was sitting in front of the screen, was kind of playing with the product. We told him to play around with it because we had just bought the company. And he stumbled into some weird log activity of data being exfiltrated to a command and control address. There was no alert that was fired. There was no signal that happened. There was no indication that anything was going wrong. It was just someone sitting in front of a screen getting pretty lucky that they happened to look at the logs. And so after that, they started going deeper and looking at what was happening. And what they realized, and this article tells the kind of full story, was that we were in the middle of a pretty massive scale attack. And it just so happened that people infiltrated through an end user laptop. They sent a phishing email. Someone opened it up. From there, they owned the machine, and they were able to laterally move themselves to a backend database of 70 million secure ID token seeds. And the idea was, if I can steal the token seeds, I can reverse engineer the algorithm and effectively get myself into US critical infrastructure at the time. So they were going after Lockheed Martin and other US federal contractors, and they felt like this was a great supply chain attack to sort of get to what they needed to. And so in the middle of the attack, we wound up shutting network access off for every single employee and application internally. We realized that we couldn't quite stop them as they were getting things out the door. So the next day we went public with the attack, and then had to basically reissue 70 million secure ID tokens over the course of the next 8 months, which wasn't a very super fun time. But it was an interesting, really, I think, great experience to understand sort of the life of what CISOs, what security operations teams need to do on a regular basis. So I'd recommend going and read the article. But the reason that I bring this up is that we just have not evolved all that much since that time. Like if you think about what we were doing back then with storing a bunch of log data, storing a bunch of full packet data, having people in front of a screen trying to sift through that information to make sense out of it, and you compare that to today and what happens in most security operations organizations and what happens in SIEM, it's not that much better, to be perfectly honest with you. Like SIEM tools today are still very much do-it-yourself tools. It's collect a bunch of logs, here you go, good luck, you figure out the rest. That's the de facto model in SIEM. We've gotten way better on the endpoint side, right? So like endpoint, when it first rolled out, EDR itself was a forensics tool. That was its job, collect a bunch of data, you build some rules and some intelligence on top of that. It's gone beyond just being a forensics tool to being a true outcome-oriented tool where there's embedded detections, embedded prevention, really sophisticated algorithms to help, stop attacks and prevent attacks, before they happen. But I don't think SIEM has evolved in the same way, to be perfectly honest with you. And in fact, it's only gotten worse, right, if you think about it. So if you think about the level of data today versus where it was, 10, 12 years ago, it's astronomically different, right? We talk to customers every day that are sending hundreds, if not up to 500, I've heard recently, terabytes a day into their SIEM, right? So that level of data volume is astronomical. And there's no way that you can keep up in any manual sense with sifting through that level of information. Number one, most systems can't even handle that level of volume. We'll talk about that as we go on why having a cloud-native system that's kind of built with the level of scale that you need to handle that level of data volume is one critical step of the equation. But if you don't have sophistication on top of that, there's just no way that you'll ever be able to keep up. Obviously, we have increasing threat actor activity. In 2011, a nation-state attacker was a fairly novel thing. It was only going after certain percentages over the organizations. Now it's a pretty commonplace thing where you're dealing with sophisticated attackers using all kinds of different techniques, and then people just drafting off of those sophisticated attackers and spreading the kind of attack landscape pretty wide. But even if you do have the people that can potentially sift through all this information, it's impossible to find them, right? So that's no new piece of news. At the end of the day, these things are still coming together and creating significant havoc, right, in most organizations. So what we hear the most, from customers and why we're so bullish about what Chronicle can do for customers in this context is these problems, still exist, and we still hear about these problems daily from customers in terms of what they can and cannot do really with their SIEM infrastructure, right? The first and most common refrain that we get is, I actually just can't store all my data, right? I have all this interesting security signal that I'm trying to gather and create and collect, and a lot of it is just not going into the system of record, either because of cost or because of scale. So I mentioned that I came from Carbon Black, and Carbon Black probably collects more data than any other endpoint tool out there. It's a pretty sophisticated endpoint tool. The number one feature request I used to get was export data filtering, meaning because customers could not send that level of data volume to their SIEMs, they would consistently just want to filter it on the export and not send it there at all. So what was happening is you were collecting all this interesting telemetry off the endpoint. The endpoint was making a decision if it was good or bad, and then you were dropping it out on the cutting room floor, basically. And the only reason they were doing this is because their SIEM infrastructure was bad. It either couldn't handle the scale and the volume, or it would cost too much to handle the scale and volume. So they were just not sending it there. They were making an arbitrary decision to cut things just in the effort of scale or cost. And that creates blind spots, right? So like when you're not sending certain levels of information into the SIEM, you're going to have significant amounts of blind spots that you have to deal with, right? The other thing that customers are saying is that things are too manual, right? They require too many people in the middle of the loop. They're not getting enough direct, I'll call it, operational help or direct embedded intelligence in the system, and it's basically a do-it-yourself system, like I mentioned before. And all of this leads to this notion of just not getting enough effective value out of the security operations tools. So what we're doing with Chronicle and the security operations suite in general, and I'll talk about how this stuff comes together, is really, I think, creating that true detection and response platform, leveraging the SIEM as the platform of choice in which to do that. Because I think there's a lot of interesting capability that you can do at the SIEM layer that is a different level of fidelity than what you could potentially do down at the endpoint layer or at the network layer. And it relies a lot on that correlation and aggregation of data and how it comes together. But you have to be able to bring enough intelligence and enough context to the equation in order for you to be able to surface the right level of signal. And I don't think a lot of SIEM vendors have done that. So that core value proposition of detecting and allowing then a deeper level of investigation off of that detection just really hasn't happened a lot in the SIEM. You've seen a few vendors like start with this notion of UABA and kind of user-based analytics as like a vector of detections that they've leveraged inside the SIEM layer. But most of those things are not built off of very scalable data platforms to begin with. So you're either getting like some sliver of detection value in a certain number of these vendors, or you're getting people that are focusing on storing data at scale. You're very rarely getting the ability to do both. And then most of the times people aren't even following up with any level of detailed enablement around response and workflow. So the goal is for us to be able to put all these things together, right? Start with a really powerful, scalable data lake, bring world-class intelligence to the table so that we can help with operational decision-making with the best intelligence around, and then providing response workflow and response automation with embedded security orchestration and response, as well as some advanced tooling around automated defense and response. So why do we think we're uniquely capable of doing this? And this is even prior to Mandiant coming onto the table. At the end of the day, not many organizations, forget about security organizations, but just organizations in general, operate at the scale in which Google operates. And Google already has a significant amount of threat intelligence just based off of the sheer volume of people, devices, and applications that we have to protect on a daily basis. So if you just think about, who else is really operating in the order of magnitude of billions of users, billions of devices, billions of email inboxes. I mean, no other security vendor can even come close to that. There's probably one other, vendor in general that can come close to that level of scale. So that right there leads us to a pretty significant amount of threat intelligence right off the bat. Right? So 4 billion Chrome devices, right? We have a tool called Safe Browsing. Every time you download a file inside of Chrome, that goes into a sandbox, and we actually analyze that file and do deep levels of forensics and sandboxing around that file. And all of that is done and then fed into a back-end threat intelligence infrastructure that Google maintains. So we do that first to protect users that are running Chrome, but all that feeds into a pretty large corpus of threat intel that's managed and maintained by Google. In addition, with Gmail inboxes, right, we provide some phishing-based, attack protection. We provide scanning of attachments inside of Gmail. Those things lead to a pretty large corpus of threat intelligence that we can operate off of. We own the world's largest, threat and IOC repository, I think, in the world with VirusTotal. Right? So VirusTotal has 2.4 billion files and URLs that are basically providing reputation understanding and daily analysis, right, collected from all the AV vendors in the world, as well as data that's being uploaded into VT for direct analysis. And all of that feeds into our core corpus of threat intelligence. And then on top of that, we have the internal tools or the internal capability that Google brings to the table just on the way Google protects itself. Right, so many of you probably have seen Phil talk about how we do things to protect things in Google scale in GCP and Google Cloud, but then even Google internal, protecting our application landscape. We have a pretty sophisticated security team, and that security team has a large corpus of threat intelligence just based off of the sophisticated attackers who are trying to act against Google itself. So all of that leads just with Google alone to having a fairly widespread set of intelligence that we can then start to operationalize in the tools downstream. But what really we think helped allowed us to take this to the next level is how do we then take what we have internally with Google and the level of knowledge and understanding that we have, and combine that with a set of experts and a set of knowledge that really is unparalleled in the industry, which is what Mandiant helped bring to the table. Right? And Mandiant Intel comes at a different angle, a slightly different angle than what we're seeing inside of Google. Right? So like when you're looking at things like even VT, where you're looking at things like safe browsing, or you're looking at things like Gmail inbox, those things are a lot of like, I don't want to call them commodity-based threats, but you're getting a lot of the wide-scale-based attacker behavior. Right? So if someone's just spamming a bunch of Gmail inboxes, you're getting pretty good indicators of compromise, but you're getting them on the wide-scale basis of people that are just kind of spraying. The Mandiant Intel is coming at it with a much more targeted understanding. Right? It's coming at it with the targeted understanding of what attackers are doing, what threat actors are doing, and it's doing that mostly through what they're able to see by dealing with the world's largest incidents and breaches, and then also the primary research that they're bringing to the table. So when you combine the two together, I think what you get is really, number one, the world's best and largest threat intelligence repository. I think when Mandiant and Google kind of bring the power of the two companies together, it really gives us unparalleled threat intelligence. But then it allows us to start operationalizing these things in product in the areas that Google does really well, which is really around scale, search at speed, being able to store data within cloud margins, right? Unlike what you would get with other third parties. And in our mind, really differentiates a true next generation security operations platform. So what you get when these things come together, and they'll be mostly operationalized through Chronicle, which I'll talk about. But you get really on the left-hand side, the capability of being able to not make compromises around data and not make compromises on how you can effectively run your security operations at cloud scale. So number one, never have to filter any data that's going into your SIEM at all, right? And you're able to do that because you're effectively operating a cloud-driven service that can scale pretty infinitely. You can do that with having sub-second search and response times. So Google Search is obviously a well-known capability, and the fact is we can store multiple petabytes of data for particular companies and allow you to search over a 12-month time period against that data and get response times that are orders of magnitude faster than you would ever get with another tool like Splunk. And that level of capability allows you to have much faster, I'll call it, data and tools and decision making at your fingertips. But then it's bringing that frontline intelligence to the equation, right? So then it's taking what you're able to get in terms of data volume and infusing data and intelligence and decision making throughout the entire thing. So for example, recently we integrated in VT reputation into Chronicle, all Chronicle events, right? So every time an event is pulled into Chronicle, if that event is associated with a file or a URL, that data immediately gets hit against the VT enterprise backend reputation store. That's millions of data entries a day that are coming into the system that are being, for each customer, that are being hit against VT. If you were going to try to connect those dots yourself, you effectively would have to buy a pretty robust individual license to VT Enterprise just to be able to pull that level of intelligence out of VT. That's now directly built in to Chronicle as a backend. And we can do the same with the Mandiant Advantage Threat Intelligence as well as part of the integrated threat intelligence, right? So you don't have to start connecting the dots yourself at the orchestration and response layer. Instead, those things can be built and orchestrated right in to every single event. And once you have them built into every single event, then you can start integrating them into things like the searches that you want to run, the detection rules that you want to write, if any level of deeper enrichment on top of a specific search or a detection rule that you want to be able to filter on, all those things can be done leveraging intelligence and enrichment right in line. And then on top of that, we want to be able to automate in as much response and actionability as possible. So we bought Simplify in December of last year, right? And the goal there was how do we create case management embedded directly into the workflow, but then also create some workflow and some playbooks that can be built and delivered out of the box. And the easiest place for us to be able to build that automation is obviously when you're dealing with cloud-specific threats or things associated with Google Cloud infrastructure. Because we own the infrastructure, it's easier for us to create that end-to-end workflow. But I think the more that we can integrate this into the into the on-prem practices of customers, whether it's EDR tools or other tools we need to push downstream response. It allows us to create more automation and just more scale in terms of how people can respond to these events in the system. And then the additional thing here is, how do we help bring context to the equation? So, another thing that SIEMs are particularly bad at is events are lacking in context. They don't have a lot of detail about where they came from, what I should know about the infrastructure that they're built around. Is there any associated risk with that level or that event that I should be aware of? So they just don't bring a lot of context to the decision making. Every event is sort of treated as the same. So there's a lot of tools from Mandiant that actually help us bring additional context to the equation that we can integrate into Chronicle to kind of bring additional risk awareness to the way you're evaluating or looking at an event. So for example, Mandiant Security Validation, it goes through a set of attack simulations, and it goes through a set of evaluations to see if your existing controls are effective in stopping specific attack techniques. If validation was running behind the scenes and feeding the system and understanding when you have a particularly vulnerable set of infrastructure to a particular attack technique, we can use that data in Chronicle. So every time an event or an alert is fired against that infrastructure, the risk associated with that event or alert can be heightened and then notified in a more critical way than you're dealing with something where you have controls in place to be able to stop a specific attack technique. So combining those two things together helps us bring an additional layer of context to the equation that you couldn't get before. And then the last thing on the bottom right-hand side here is, how do we help bring the capability of people to the equation so that if you do have an incident or you do have a situation where you need experts at your disposal, they're there and ready to go. So one example of that is having the Mandiant Incident Response team leveraging Chronicle in the back end of the Security Operations Suite as a core piece of their capability that they bring to the table. And so whenever they need to get up and running on a particular incident or a particular engagement, they can immediately do that based on the data that you're already storing and handling inside of Chronicle. And that obviously allows them to do their job a lot better because you have a historical set of information that's unfiltered for them to work off of right out of the gate. And not only that, but you don't necessarily have to be dealing with a specific incident in order to get value out of that type of engagement. They can also come in and deliver some understanding and capability on an on-demand basis, right? So if you just need to filter up a certain set of indicators, have people that they're ready to help you triage and handle those indicators, Mandiant can now get engaged as an overlaid service on top of the core product platform. So bring all these together, and I think we effectively are starting to create, in our mind, a truly modern security operations platform and a truly modern security operation experience, right? And it goes up and down the chain of having kind of really core SIEM capability or disposal, but then infusing a lot of intelligence and operational decision making into the equation, and then rounding that out with orchestration, response, and workflow on the back end of that. And I'll go through each one of these in just a little bit more color, and we'll take some slides take some questions at the end. So I talked a lot about cloud scale data and what that means, but just to put a little color around it and a little specificity around it. Chronicle out of the box has 12 months of data retention for every single piece of information that gets sent in. That's not normal in SIEM world, right? Typically, even cloud-based SIEMs will come out of the box with 3 months of data retention. And then usually every other piece of, every other day that you want to keep the data, you have to pay additional fees in order to keep the data for longer, right? So you're immediately making compromises on how long you're going to keep the data in the system. EDR data is usually 30 days, right? Is the extent of time frame that you have to hold data inside the system. And the reason that we made this decision is actually when Chronicle was first built, we tried to model against what our existing security team needed to do in order for them to perform their investigations. And their best practice was, hey, I need to have at least 8 to 12 months of visibility into the events that are happening in order for me to adequately protect the system. So that's a core capability out of the box. We actually don't even offer any lower data retention periods. Everything is 12 months, hot data storage built into the system. But the other key thing here is we operate on a disruptive price point and a disruptive economic model. So we actually pioneered this notion of having employee-based pricing for SIM. So the standard model in most SIM engagements is ingest-based pricing. So every single piece of data that gets sent into the system effectively draws down your ingest cap. And so you're kind of left with this decision-making point of, is it economically viable, or is it important enough for me to send this data in? Because I know I'm going to get metered on this, and I have to be able to determine whether it's important or not. And we don't want you to have to make that decision. It's not something that at the time of sending data into the system, you want to be thinking about just arbitrary costs and how that's going to draw down the cost. So we pushed this model and pioneered this model of, we'll just charge you based on the size of your organization, right? If you have a large number of employees, you pay and cover the employee base, and then based off of that, you can send in as much data as you want. And again, store at 12 months out of the box by default. Now, we do have some ingest models just for transparency, like because we have a lot of cloud customers that don't really have a really good relationship between employees and the amount of data that they send in. Like, let's take Spotify, for example. It's a big GCP customer. They have a small number of employees, very large amount of data. So in those models, we tend to use ingest as a way of solving that customer problem. But the vast majority of our customers are on this employee-based model with Chronicle. And this is something that we're proud of, and we think solves one major pain point, which is just the ability for you to unlock value out of the data that you store in the system. And you hear this from customers as well. It's a pretty common refrain that I hear from a lot of customers. I've heard it a number of times here, where people will come in and say, I hate Splunk, and you ask, well, why do you hate Splunk? And they say, well, the cost. That's like almost 99% of the time, that's what they say. There's obviously some issues with the scale and capability of the product, but most of the time, a lot of the issues come down to cost. The second thing is around, how fast can I get access to that data, right? So it can be pretty onerous to search large volumes of information in some of these legacy SIM tools, right? And they weren't necessarily built for searching and investigating at that level of volume on a regular basis. Even EDR vendors were not built to search at that level of data with this level of response time. So when you're dealing with, like in some cases, 20 petabytes of hot storage of information for a particular customer, but you need to get answers fast, you need to be able to apply pretty sophisticated search capability to the equation. Google itself has highly sophisticated IP on how quickly you can search over large volumes of data. We bring that IP into Chronicle. So again, this is one reason that having 12 months of hot storage is a critical capability, but being able to search over that hot storage we think is highly unique. And the fact is, like, we have vastly better response times in terms of how quickly we get data back in the system. And that goes for things that are, I'll call it real-time searches, like investigations that are happening in real time. But it also applies to how we run rules against the system or against data that's coming in. So we have a rule engine that is powered in Chronicle. It's called URL. So every time data gets sent into the system, we run that against the URL rule set that you have applied. Even when data comes in that might be time-stamped as like older data, like 30 days old, we'll go back and reevaluate all the URL rules associated with that data volume so that you have a full understanding of when you should be notified of particular detections. So that's super critical, right, in terms of the ability for you to get data at your disposal very fast. The other thing that we do here is we enrich and contextualize every piece of data that comes in. So when you look at what you typically get in a SIM system, you're sending log data in, and you're indexing off of only certain pieces of that log data. So you say, look, I'm going to create an index around the IP address or an index around a host name or something that's a narrow subset of data. So when you want to draw correlation between the data, it's very hard to do that in some cases because they're not intrinsically linked in any way, shape, or form. It's just a generic bucket of log data. We don't do that. So we transform every piece of data into what's called the UDM, Unified Data Model. And after we transform it into the Unified Data Model, we then create aggregations and enrichment on top of that information. So I can go into Chronicle and I can say, I just want to look for user Chris. and we'll give you all of the results back in a very clear user-driven dashboard that is associated with my username. And that's the reason that we can do that is because we've already re-enriched all of the data after it's been pulled into UDM. We've then gone over it and said, okay, what's all the data that's associated with this particular user? So that embedded connection point and enrichment is kind of built into every piece of information that comes in. And that allows us to power these contextual visualizations in the product. Yeah, so just quick customer feedback there. So like, we typically get very, very good feedback, especially from managed service partners who like run a lot of their operations on Chronicle, where they just give us, pretty consistent information about how quickly they can run their investigations and do that over large corpuses of data. Okay, the other thing here, which is I'm particularly interested in coming from a detection and response background, is how do we bring intelligence to the equation? And this is where the Mandiant capability starts coming into play. So I talked about all of the raw sources of information that we have at our disposal. We started Chronicle as having kind of IOC matching based on the raw threat intel that we have in the system. So we would just basically overlay IOC matches of the data that came in. But that's not really I'll call it a scalable situation, because IOC matches can be pretty voluminous. So what we've done is we've actually delivered something that we call curated detections directly in Chronicle. So what that is we have a threat detection team. That threat detection team is writing, creating analytics in product and delivering them the same way you would get in an EDR system. Right? So out of the box, you can come into Chronicle, say, I want to turn on ransomware detection, or I want to turn on cloud data exfiltration detection, and you effectively get delivered intelligence right out of the box. And all that's being powered by the raw information that I showed on the last slide, and will be even further powered by a lot of the things that Mandiant brings to the table. But at the end of the day, it's as easy as just flipping the detection switch, which again is a lot of, taken from the outcome-driven approach that a lot of the EDR vendors had brought to the equation. You might have saw the Mandiant breach analytics conversation or announcement on Monday. This is one area where we were able to immediately apply value between Mandiant and Google right away. So basically, because Google had this large corpus of data, Mandiant had a product called Automated Defense that basically was providing curated detections and analytics on top of data inside of your SIEM. So, before the acquisition closed, we started working on integrating in Mandiant breach analytics, which takes their interesting threat intelligence and IOC data that they're getting from their engagements. It applies it against the corpus of data inside of Chronicle. Then it runs through a set of models to be able to quiet down some of the noisy matches, and effectively gets delivered via a set of alerts that you need to pay attention to, right? So now that's our core piece of Chronicle's capability, which is we have the Mandiant analytic overlay on top of the Chronicle data set that's ready to go based on the announcement on Monday. And then, of course, if you need to run your own rules and detections, you can do that. We have a very powerful rules engine in URL, and that allows customers to write and author their own rules. You can run those rules in what we call a retro hunt mode, so you can go back and look over the 12 months of data and see what would be hit in that rule, or you can turn it into live mode, where effectively we'll run it against any new data that comes into the system, and then proactively alert you when you're having hits against your rule set. And then automated response. So in this case, how do we hand off those rule hits and that intelligence into a workflow? That makes sense. Simplify, we felt, was a really powerful, case management and orchestration layer. A lot of customers were already using that as an augmentation tool to their existing SIEM. So they would use Splunk or other tools as their backend SIEM, and then feed that data into Simplify as the case management and SOAR layer. So we have that now built directly into Chronicle. So we renamed Simplify Chronicle SOAR. The core case management interface in Simplify is now the core alerting experience in Chronicle. So every time you get an event or an alert that comes out of Chronicle, it's immediately sent over into the cases. And what that allows us to do is perform some aggregation of the raw event data. So when you have alerts that are coming in, we aggregate them into a case. That case gets associated with a particular threat type. So it says, hey, this is a phishing incident or case that you need to handle. And then based on that phishing incident, Simplify creates and runs a set of playbooks. And those playbooks are not always like magic automation. A lot of times those playbooks are just pulling in additional enrichment sources so that you have the rest of the data at your fingertips to make a better decision about that particular case. And a phishing case has a different playbook associated than, let's say, a ransomware case. So based on the threat category that's associated with the alert, we'll run a certain set of playbooks and enrichment that's associated with that particular alert type, so that when an analyst comes in, they immediately have the information they need to triage that and make a decision. And then I talked about contextual awareness. This is the ability for us to kind of pull in additional context data, understand your attack surface, understand where you might be exposed inside the infrastructure, and then apply that into the data in Chronicle. So we have a capability in Chronicle called context-aware detections. So if you want in a rule or a search to apply it only to certain, I'll call it types of data or certain types of infrastructure where you have a set of risk that is associated with it, that can be applied directly in the rule. So one good example of that is like when you have a vulnerability on a machine, you might say, I only want this rule to be hit when I get informed of a particular vulnerability or a high level of vulnerability being on that asset. And that's like context-aware detection, a risk-based detection. And what that does is it just heightens the risk associated with that detection, and it can actually be an actual deterministic way of saying whether you want an alert to fire or not to fire. So I talked about Mandiant security validation, one way of feeding into that context graph. In addition, Mandiant attack surface management, another way of feeding into that context graph. So both of those things will kind of help create this contextual awareness inside the product. And then last thing is just the unparalleled expertise. Like this one I think is one of the biggest synergy points between Mandiant and Google. I think this allows us to give people that safety net. In the worst case scenario, if there's an incident that occurs, you have a world-class team ready at your disposal to come in and help engaging right away. Mandiant also has managed defense capability. Our goal is to help build that managed defense capability on top of Chronicle. So if you don't have the people to help operationalize a lot of these things, if you don't have the skill set to run your own detections, we obviously want to build some of those things out of the box. But if you need to have people help operate this environment, the Mandiant Managed Defense team can also help to do that in the future. So the goal is to get you closer to these experts in the system and closer to the people that are seeing the latest and greatest attack techniques, so you feel like they're part of it with you, like they're in the boat with you, which helps deliver this outcome-oriented model of security operations. So those are the main points I wanted to go over. I'm happy to take some questions if we have time, but I think these are the 3 key points to remember, which is really be able to have world-class expertise and have that intelligence from the front lines, bringing the power of what Google does really well from a scale and operational perspective together, but then also having expertise available when you need it. Any questions or, yeah?
Oh, I've got a big mouth. I didn't think this was necessary. Moving forward, I mean, you've done a wonderful job building this platform, but what's the relationship that you envision 12, 24 months from now between Chronicle and EDR? What does each one do? What are the roles? What are the interactions, if there are any?
Yeah. So, I mean, EDR is still going to be a primary, frontline detection tool. And it'll remain that way, right? So I think you're hearing a lot of noise from the EDR vendors about XDR and kind of the things that they're going to try to do to expand beyond making endpoint decisions. But the reality is most of those platforms aren't built that way. And again, this is coming from the EDR land. I know they're not built the way you would need to be built in order to collect and aggregate data and make decision points off of a variety of data that they don't own from an endpoint perspective. So we still expect EDR to be a primary tool for endpoint-driven decision-making and to be that frontline tool. But if there's anything that relies on correlation of data or relies on looking at aggregated EDR detections in like a longer period of time, then that's the role that the SIEM needs to play, which is ultimately where I think quote-unquote XDR is going to evolve to. So we're still going to partner very closely with EDR vendors. We have a very good relationship with CrowdStrike, very good relationship with SentinelOne. So absent of Microsoft, just candidly, I think we'll have strong partnerships with every EDR vendor, as well as have Mandiant incident response services running on top of those EDR vendors directly. In fact, Mandiant already announced support for CrowdStrike incident response. So like they can run their engagements on top of CrowdStrike today, and then SentinelOne is soon to come. Any other questions? Yeah.
How about the FedRAMP? How about the FedRAMP compliance perspective? Being in a public sector side, that will be one of the main criteria that what we have observed.
Yeah, FedRAMP, is that what you said? You said FedRAMP?
Yeah, FedRAMP.
Yeah. So Chronicle is already FedRAMP moderate. So obviously we operate cloud-driven. So we're a cloud-driven tool. We don't have any on-prem capability with Chronicle. So we're FedRAMP moderate. We plan to be FedRAMP high, mid next year. So probably Q2, Q3. So we already can deliver to certain federal agencies based on needs of moderate users, but high is also on the roadmap as well. Any other questions?
What do you see happening with current MDR customers, mandated MDR customers, moving forward, who are running different SIMs today and have made those investments? How long before they are kind of told to go into Chronicle?
Yeah. So I think obviously most of the Mandiant Managed Defense services are operating on top of endpoint-based engagements today, right? So I'm assuming if you are a Mandiant Managed Defense customer, you're likely using FireEye or some version of FireEye and kind of using the tool that way. So we fully expect that to continue. I think the Mandiant Managed Defense business will likely evolve beyond FireEye because I think there's a broader opportunity to go after managed defense services without FireEye being a direct engagement with Mandiant. But I don't think there'll be any non-support for those types of engagements. You don't have to be running Chronicle in those engagements to get value. And in fact, they don't even really deal with the SIM layer in today's world of managed defense. So I think there should be no change in support in that model.
How about integrations with the threat intelligence platform, like MISP?
Yeah, with Mandiant's Threat Intel platform or another one?
Anyone.
Yeah. So I think like Threat Intel, we think will be a core integrated functionality between Chronicle and Mandiant, right? So I think there's two integration points. One is with VT and with Mandiant Threat Intel, right? So I think it makes sense over time for you to be able to look at aggregated intel coming from both what Mandiant is gathering as kind of, we'll call it frontline intelligence or frontline research, as well as what VT is getting from a crowdsourced perspective, and some additional things that VT users tend to do with VT, which is upload their files to run against like corpuses of Yara rules. Those tend to be the types of engagements that people use with VT. Over time, I can envision those things happening through a single platform or portal where you have one threat intelligence platform where you can see both corpuses of data. They serve different needs, but it makes sense to have them in one place. When it comes to overlaying that into SIM, the expectation is that customers shouldn't have to do a bunch of digging into threat intel themselves. They can if they want to. Those portals will exist for them to go directly into the intel platforms. But the hope is that, number one, we deliver a lot of intel through curated detections, or we provide the automated enrichment on top of the event data on your behalf, right? So if you just, I'll call it activate VT and Mandiant Advantage Threat Intel on top of Chronicle, we're doing all of the matching against the data directly with the intel and providing you the ability of, integrating that into your search or your rules without you having to connect the dots yourself, if that makes sense. So that's really going to be the plan there. We've already done that with VT, like I mentioned, but I think Mandiant Advantage Threat Intel will be the next integration point for that. Any other questions? Good? Okay. All right. I appreciate the time.